What's going on, everyone? Today I'm going to be giving you a ranking of all 4 Terrifier films from the worst to the best. And yes, there is 4 Terrifier films. A lot of people don't know about the first one, but we're going to talk about that in this video. So let's get right to it. In last place is going to be All Hallows Eve, and this is the one that a lot of people probably don't even know about, but technically this is the first Terrifier film. This released in 2013, and it actually is an anthology film, so that means there are separate stories within one movie. And the way it plays out is pretty interesting. You have this babysitter watching these kids on Halloween night. The kids get this VHS tape in, while they're trick-or-treating, and they decide to watch the VHS tape just to see what's on it. And it ends up being these really creepy short films that are essentially pushed together as one full movie. Now, Art the Clown only shows up in 2 of these short films, in the beginning and as well as towards the end. And I would say the end portion of this movie, the last like 30 minutes, is definitely the best part of the movie. That's where Art the Clown is fully there, and that's the part I definitely recommend watching. Not that the whole movie isn't worth watching, but at the very least, if you just want to see it for Art the Clown, definitely watch that end portion. But I do actually like this movie, weirdly enough, even though it's in the last place. I think there is something very creepy and eerie about how it's done. It's in some ways scarier than all of the other Terrifier films, which I don't rank movies based on how scary they are. That's just not something I personally do. But if you wanted to be scared, I think this one will more likely do that compared to the Terrifier films. Obviously, the Terrifier films are more gory and grotesque, but I just think the lack of comedy in this one, it's just, there's something about it, because obviously the Terrifier movies, they're quite funny. They're quite comedic in a lot of ways. You're kind of watching it to just be grossed out and have a lot of, funny moments here or there. But All Hallows Eve genuinely has some scary moments, especially towards the end of the movie, and the way it ends is really messed up, but it's pretty cool, I will say. Mike Gianelli is playing Art the Clown in this film. It's actually not David Howard Thornton, and he actually does a good job. Although I obviously prefer David Howard Thornton's portrayal in the later films, I do actually like Art the Clown in this movie. I do think he actually is scarier, but he's less funny. So what would you rather have, a funny Art or a scarier one? I don't know. I do think David Howard Thornton is extremely scary as Art the Clown, don't get me wrong, but I think just the way this one's directed, they somehow make Art even scarier in a sense. But the reason it's in last place is because there's a whole middle section of this movie, and even most of the beginning, that I just think is really boring. The other stories that they do that don't involve Art the Clown, I don't really care for, and I think it's definitely smart of them to have, taken this Art the Clown character and build upon it, because that was clearly the best part of All Hallows Eve. It's also got some messy writing here or there, especially some of the dialogue I don't think works all that well. At the end of the day, I would still recommend this movie, even though I don't think it's that great. In number 3 spot, I've got Terrifier from 2016. This is the one that most people would consider to be the first Terrifier film, because it is the first actual, full-on Terrifier movie. Now, I actually watched this movie around the time when it first came out. I watched it on Netflix, I think maybe like a year after it released, and at that point, no one really knew who this character was. Nobody was really talking about him. Well, he wasn't really mainstream like he is now. But me and my friend just watched it in the basement one day, and it was honestly just like a really strange movie to watch, especially how it opens and just how creepy Art the Clown is as a character. But it was mostly comedic in a lot of ways to us. We just found some of it to be really funny. But once you got to some of those kill scenes, it kind of changed things, because yes, it was funny, but then it just started becoming like, oh my God, this is the most amount of gore I think I've seen in a horror movie up to this point, at least, when I was that age. So I was kind of like, wow, this is huge, especially when you get to the hacksaw kill. The hacksaw kill was one of the craziest things I've ever seen. Even to this day, I would say it still is one of the best kills in this franchise. They show a lot. It's grotesque, it's disgusting, but it's effective because of how real it looks. And especially given the lower budget these movies tend to have, it's incredible work. Like, it really is. If you're gonna watch this movie for anything, it's gonna be for the kills, it's gonna be for the practical effects, it's gonna be for the gore, or it's gonna be for David Howard Thornton's portrayal as Art the Clown. But as a movie, I do think this one isn't that great either, because it does kind of drag a bit in some sections. I think there's a lot of moments of meandering where characters are just kind of walking around, and I know that's kind of like the vibe horror movies are supposed to give off. There's supposed to be moments of them, walking around creepy buildings and stuff like that. But I think they do a little bit too much of that in this movie, and I don't think there's enough eerie vibes for it to work. I do think there's a great soundtrack here. I mean, all these movies have a great soundtrack, but they have a really cool theme here for Art the Clown that I think is just incredible and carries over into all the movies, thankfully. I think the characters are probably the weakest part of this movie. I didn't really get that interested in Tara or Victoria, and I think that might be the issue, is that they kind of switch main characters like halfway through the movie, which is an interesting concept, but it just doesn't give me enough time to ever really care about these characters or latch onto them or care about really much of what's going on in this movie at all. I think the location isn't that interesting either. I mean, they're just in a warehouse the whole movie, and ultimately it's just not that interesting of a warehouse, at least in my opinion. But it is the start of Art the Clown, and I think as a movie it is mostly effective. I do still enjoy it. I just think it's not amazing or anything. But then we get into the number 2 spot, and these top 2 movies here, keep this in mind, these could change any day of the week. I think both of these movies are pretty much on par in terms of quality and how much I love them. It's a pretty big gap as well. Like from the 3rd spot to the 2nd spot here, it's a massive gap. We're going from like a 5 out of 10 movie to like an 8 out of 10 movie here. So pretty huge gap. I really love both of these films, so I want to make that absolutely clear, but I just had to pick one to be above the other. And so in the number 2 spot, I'm gonna go with Terrifier 3. Now, again, this is something that I think will 100% change in the future. It's more than likely to change. Even just right now, I'm like debating it in my head. No, I could probably switch them, but I'm just gonna pick Terrifier 3. And there's one reason that Terrifier 2 is above Terrifier 3, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I loved Terrifier 3. I think this was a fantastic film. I loved the death scenes. They were easily the most brutal in the franchise. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I think there's definitely a couple of scenes like the hacksaw kill in the bedroom scene from part 2, but I just think there was so much more. Like there was at least 4 to 5 moments in this movie where I felt the need to kind of like turn away just a little bit for like half a second, because I was just that grossed out by it. And those moments don't happen as frequently in the other movies, and I think that's definitely a sign that their gore is effective. It is disgusting, it is realistic looking, but that's why it works. And I think this movie just has some of the most amount of moments that are like that. I also love what they do with Sienna's character here, the way she's dealing with the trauma from the last movie. They actually do it, you know, pretty decently. I would say out of all these movies, this is probably the best written. There's just really solid writing, the dialogue. You can tell they've got things going now. They know what they're dealing with here. They know they're dealing with a big franchise that is blowing up like we've never seen before. I mean, this character is now becoming almost as popular as some of the big 3 like Jason, Freddy, and Michael. I think he has potential to be in the conversation of like the top 10 most iconic horror characters, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the time Terrifier 4 comes out, he's included in that ranking. But this movie, you can clearly tell they're up in their game here, because it does feel a lot more tightly written, and I think a lot of what they're doing with Sienna's character is kind of proof of that. You can actually tell this is a character that is interesting, and obviously Lauren Lavera's acting is a big part of that. She does a great job here in this movie, and I also like the addition of some of the other new characters. The Christmas theme was also a nice touch. I actually really like that these movies are doing that. They're finding completely separate themes for each film. I really hope Terrifier 4 is summer themed. I think that's like the one thing they haven't done. Terrifier 2 was obviously Halloween themed. This was Christmas themed. Let's do a 4th of July themed Terrifier 4. I think that would be so awesome. The poster could be like Art the Clown sitting on the beach sipping a drink or something. I don't know. I'm just throwing out random ideas. But I think the Christmas theme was really awesome, and it definitely added a lot to the movie. And the same thing with Terrifier 2. Somehow this movie's able to capture like a retro Christmas feel to it. Like it almost feels like this movie takes place in the 80s or the 90s, but it doesn't. It doesn't. It takes place in present day, but the way it's shot, the way they handle it, you can tell they're trying to go for that old classic feel, and I really like that. Like the fact that they've done that for pretty much all these movies is probably what makes these movies so appealing to me, and to a lot of others as well. Like the fact that they're able to capture that era without actually having it take place in that era is such a cool thing. Like it almost feels like if you were making a movie in the 80s, but it was modern day. You know what I mean? Like it's just, I just think that's so cool, and I think this movie captures that very, very well. This is also easily the funniest movie in the franchise. Like if you're going there purely for laughs, I think this is by far the most I laughed watching a Terrifier film. They know that this is a funny character. They know this is a comedic character that's gonna have some funny things to say, and they found a way to include that, man. They really did. I mean, just off the top of my head, that bar scene with the Santa, I mean, that was probably the funniest scene in the franchise. I was dying of laughter. Just a lot of it has to do with just Art the Clown, his facial expressions, his reactions to things. He's just such a funny character, and I think this is by far the funniest they've ever handled him in, which is crazy because at the same time of him being the funniest here, I would also say he's also the most brutal he's ever been, where he's just absolutely like tearing people apart. And the opening scene is proof of that. Some really dark shit happens, and then seconds later, he's kicking back, eating cookies, and it's a funny scene. Like, the fact that they're able to go from just insanely brutal to hilarious within seconds is, I think, what makes his character so effective. The end fight between Sienna and Art the Clown in this movie is also one of the coolest things in this franchise. There's also a great one in Terrifier 2, but this one I just thought was so cool with the chainsaw and her using the sword. So awesome. But in the #1 spot has to be Terrifier 2. Now, this is something that, like I said, could change, but the one thing putting this above Terrifier 3, the one thing, is the soundtrack. The soundtrack is just so incredible in this movie. It's got some of my favorite music ever included in a horror film, like original music and licensed music. There's a lot of amazing like 80s synthwave type music in here, and oh my god, I love it. I absolutely love it. Unfortunately, Terrifier 3 didn't include a lot of that. They had some, but not enough, at least not for me. But this one, just there's so much incredible pieces of music, and I think it adds a lot to the aesthetic and the feel of it. And I do like the Halloween aesthetic this movie has as well. Again, just like with the Christmas aesthetic, they're able to somehow capture a like retro 80s to 90s Halloween feel, even though it takes place in present day. That to me is just so interesting and so cool. And I really like the setup to this movie. I like how it slowly gets to the point of Sienna being involved with what's going on with Art the Clown. Even though Art the Clown is killing people the entire movie, it kind of reminds me of Halloween in that way, the original Halloween, where, I mean, Laurie Strode doesn't really get involved with Michael Myers until like the end of the movie, but throughout it, you're still dealing with the eeriness and you know, the fact that this character is out there. But obviously Art the Clown is way more in your face about it. He's absolutely just killing people like crazy throughout the entire movie. The bedroom scene is definitely the standout scene in the movie. Absolutely disgusting. There's a lot of other characters that get killed in this, and then Sienna comes across all this towards the end, and she has one of the most badass final showdowns against a slasher character ever. Like, just, it's so cool what they do. I love how she's in her costume still. It's a really cool design. And Sienna as a whole has a lot of depth here. She has actually a, you know, a full character to her, where I feel like we were missing that in the first movie. We didn't really have a character to latch onto, but obviously Sienna is that character for us here. She has a, you know, a bit of a backstory. She, obviously her father passed away, and he's an artist, and he created some of these characters, and one of the characters is of course the one that she dresses up as, and I think that's just so cool. And they add some more to that story in Terrifier 3 as well. But in Terrifier 2, it's just so cool getting to see her in that costume and then fighting Art the Clown in the end. And there's a bit of a fantastical element thrown in there towards the end of the movie, and I actually really like it, even though when I first watched the movie I didn't like it. I was like, you know, I think that's too much. But after, you know, watching it again, I was like, no, this is actually really cool. I'm a big fan of A Nightmare on Elm Street and that franchise, and it kind of reminded me of that in a sense. The dreamlike world that she was in at that one point, when she was in the water tank, stuff like that actually worked for me, and I thought it was actually really awesome. And I actually like the direction they're going in with making Sienna a supernatural person in a sense. All in all, that's my ranking of all the Terrifier movies. Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comment section down below. Which ones are your favorites and which ones are your least favorites? I would love to hear it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Peace out, everyone.